Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Katharine Stevens. I'm a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, specializing in early childhood learning and development. It's my great honor to host today's conversation with Professor James Heckman on the role of families in human flourishing. A little background on Professor Heckman. He's been at the Department of Economics at the University of Chicago, my alma mater, since 1973. He was one of the founders of U of C's Harris School of Public Policy. And since 1991, he's also been a research fellow at the American Bar Foundation. In May 2014, he launched the Center for the Economics of Human Development at the University of Chicago. In 2000, Professor Heckman shared the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on the microeconometrics of diversity and heterogeneity, and for establishing a sound causal basis for public policy evaluation.
Right.
He's received dozens of additional awards for his work, has published over 300 articles and 9 books, and is currently co-editor of the Journal of Political Economy. Professor Heckman's primary focus throughout his professional life has been on trying to understand the origins of major social and economic problems like inequality, social mobility, and discrimination, and to finding effective strategies for addressing those problems. Today, I'll be talking with him about his recent interdisciplinary research on human development and skill formation over the life cycle. That work is focused on examining the origins of inequality, the determinants of social mobility, and the links among stages of the human life cycle starting in the womb. We'll take 50 minutes or so for my one-on-one discussion with Professor Heckman about this recent work, and then hope you'll join the conversation with your questions. There are 2 ways to ask questions. You can email them to martha.baker@aei.org, martha.baker@aei.org, or send them via Twitter using hashtag Heckman@AEI. Also, please feel free to send questions along as they come to mind. We'll collect them as we go along to answer after the discussion. With that, Professor Heckman, I'm truly thrilled to welcome you to AEI today for this conversation.
Well, I look forward to it. I hope we have some chance to talk about some ideas and think more deeply about certain aspects of public policy.
Terrific. So as you and I have discussed a couple of times over the years, while many people are aware of your outstanding research on particular early childhood programs like Perry and Abecedarian, and are familiar with the Heckman Curve, I believe many people misunderstand or simply don't know the fundamental ideas that underpin and drive so much of your work. So I'd like to spend our first 20 to 30 minutes focusing on your theory of human capital development because it's so crucial to your thinking, and I'm especially eager for our audience to get a better understanding of its depth and nuance. So to start with, you've said that the source of a nation's wealth is the skill of its people. Can you explain what you mean by that and how it fits into your theory of human capital development?
Well, that's an old idea. I think you'll find the seeds of that idea in Adam Smith and virtually every economist who's ever thought about the larger aspect of the economy until at least until the beginning of the 20th century, when human skills kind of were put to the side with a real emphasis on capital, physical capital, investment as being an important component of economic development. But it's also the case, especially starting at the University of Chicago with people like my former colleagues, late colleagues, I should say, Ted Schultz and Gary Becker, and of my colleague at Columbia, where I was for a while, Jacob Mincer. There was an emphasis on human capital and understanding that the skills invested and created in a person play as big a role as any capital in creating the flourishing of an economy. And so I think there's been a fairly recent, and I mean by recent, the last 60, 70 years, understanding that both physical and human capital play a central role in creating the wealth of a country and the development of the country and the development of its people. And more than just an aggregate of economic productivity. It creates opportunity for the individual. I mean, for generations, people have talked about education. Education is only one form of human capital, an important form. And we now understand education as part of a general skill formation process. So the idea is to use economic theory to integrate aspects of human capabilities and how they're formed, and of course, how they work with capital as well. So it's a very rich area, which really allows us to examine how the economy is evolving. What are the characteristics of people that cause them to be successful? And what are the characteristics of groups of people that cause economies to develop and to take advantage of opportunities as they come along?
So can you explain what you describe as the technology of skill formation?
Well, it's a very basic idea. See, one thing I worry about in this whole literature is economists, and for that matter, academics generally, may take a very simple idea and obscure it into something that becomes almost incomprehensible. So I want to go back to the very basic idea. You can think of like a tree or any kind of organic mechanism, any kind of plant. Let's take a plant as an example. The dynamics of the growth of a tree, a plant, a person, is really the question of how one forms the base. In the case of the tree, you plant a seed, the seed grows, and then as the seed and the tree are nourished, I should say, the tree grows. The same is true of a human being, that we really are born, and its conditions even before birth play a fundamental role. And I don't just mean genetics, although genetics does play a big role. I think anybody denying the role of genetics is just denying reality. But there is a powerful role too for experience, for family, and for environment. And then what we've learned from the neuroscientists is a lot. I mean, I have a colleague here at the University of Chicago, late colleague now, who talked about neuroplasticity some 30, 40 years ago. Name was Huttenlocher. And they talked about the idea of how the brain was forming and how all the synapses and how the connective tissue of the brain, the gray matter and the white matter were forming. And they were conditioned on the experience that those children had. And so they build on each other. So you build a synaptic link. You can keep that link if you use that link. And then you can expand on that link. So it's the biology that's at the core of this, but it's also the interaction with society, because families can nourish those links or suppress them. And we have a lot of evidence on both.
So you've described skill formation of a life cycle process.
Yes.
And you talk about characteristics of skills like self-productivity, dynamic complementarity. Can you describe what that means? What the life
Okay,
cycle
well, there's different names for this concept. Dynamic complementarity has a counterpart in some other aspects of both sociology and for that matter, psychology. And that is something called the Matthew effect. And the Matthew effect more generally says that to those who have, more is given. Now, the dynamic complementarity is a little bit more specific than that. And so the Matthew effect was originally created as a statement about scholarship and citations in science. But actually, there's something deeper here. So it's like a Matthew effect, but what it is that we think about a productivity. So I'm an economist, so we think about what I call production functions. You make inputs, the inputs interact with what the available stock of skills is, and then those inputs then lead to the next stage of skill. So skill formation is a dynamic process. And so what happens then with this dynamic complementarity is that if you have a good skill base, then down the road, further investments like schooling, like work experience, like interaction with your colleagues at the workplace or out in society at large, become generally more productive. So if you get an early skill base, you can go forward in life and basically do more skill and be more productive at every activity you undertake. So it's a statement about how you form skills. So once you have it, it's easier to get more of it, is the claim. So there really is a sense in which it's just a very, very simple and intuitive process. But it is a process that involves dynamic actions, that agents are basically parents, society, schools, teachers, workers, co-workers are essentially interacting with you or with the person we're considering and helping to create skills and opportunities for that person. But a good skill base is important. So for example, I'll give you an example that's really very important for public policy. A lot of people are concerned about the black-white gap in college going. We see big gaps in who goes to college, okay? No question about it. We still do. It's narrowed, but it's still there. And many people say, oh, what we should do then is try to give tuition scholarships for kids at age 18 or 19 and try to encourage those kids to go to college with the cheaper tuition, or maybe even lower the standards or whatever is necessary to get more kids to go to school. But I think what happens in many of those programs is people even offer those programs, scholarship programs, won't take those programs. Why? Because often they perceive that they don't have the skills that it's required in college. So before you really start promoting people from high school to go to college, you need to build the skills so the person can get to high school, can graduate. And then it just goes back. You say, okay, we go from high school, we go to the 8th grade, the kids really have to learn the skills. So learning is a cumulative process. So we build this base of knowledge, but if we don't have a core, we don't have basic skills of reasoning, of self-control, of various aspects of what are called executive functioning, that we really have very great difficulty proceeding all the way down the rest of life. So it's just basically saying you need a good start. And then that start, I wouldn't say it's self-propelling, but it makes it easier to take advantages all the way down the line. So that's the idea, really, very basic idea, but probably not much different from asking how does a redwood grow? Although I know a lot less about redwoods than I do about people, but it's still the case that you would think that if a redwood, starts in a situation of starvation, of water, desert-like environment, it's not going to grow very well. It's going to be very difficult to remediate. And the same is true for dynamic complementarity. And that's the other side. Because what dynamic complementarity says is that the later we wait to remediate, the harder it is to remediate. And that's got both biological principles and economic and psychological principles underlying it. So it has this dual notion. It gives you the sense of why it's good to invest early and to act early. But it also tells you that if you decide, no, I want to put things later, then you're going to have a serious limitation. And this has important public policy implications that, if you go back to the Great Society, say, take Lyndon Johnson's Great Society in 1964, 65, he launches this program. And if you thought about this program to end poverty, Johnson was a real optimist about what people could do. So he was talking about changing the skills. He helped start Head Start. His group started Head Start, education programs, college, job training programs all the way down the life cycle, even for people, steel workers, age 55, laid off in Buffalo, say, we're going to be given retraining. And what the unfortunate consequence was is that the later we waited in life, if we started kind of remediating the unemployed Buffalo steel worker at 55, but a lot of those steel workers wouldn't even want to participate in those retraining efforts. They just wouldn't see the benefit. They didn't think they had much to live. And the ugly fact is that it's harder and harder to learn the older you are. It gets it's nothing impossible. There's a lot of neuroplasticity. That was Hutton-Locker's idea. You can get cell growth in brains until in the 80s, 90s, and so forth. But the fact is it's harder. And so the young people are more flexible. And a baby is the most flexible of all, because the baby's just soaking at building the architecture that's going to create flourishing for the rest of one's life. And that is, I think, the logic of everything I'm talking about. But it's not, it's amazing, precisely because people are so wedded to particular aspects of skill formation that they don't want to put this into a life cycle perspective and really understand. I had long discussions. One of my thesis advisors at Princeton was Bill Bowen, who was president of Princeton, very important figure in education and in labor economics, for that matter. And he was very well intended in trying to promote the attendance of minorities at Princeton and in the Ivy Leagues, or generally. And I was, he'd send me his letter, his papers, and so forth. And I said, well, Bill, you're starting way too late. I mean, these kids are 18. Why don't you start at 3? Why don't you start at 1? Why don't you start early? And so I think by the time he died, he was down to about the 8th grade. If he'd lived a little longer, I think he probably would have gone all the way to the origin, but he didn't, so we left it unfinished.
So, you've this is what you're explaining, that skills attained at one stage of the life cycle boosts skill attainment at later stages.
It facilitates it, and it's not only the skill itself. So there's some kind of self-productivity, but it's other skills help you acquire skills. So here's an example. There's something that the psychologists call executive functioning. That has to do with the capacity of self-control, regulation, the ability to stay on task. Some economists, some sociologists, some psychologists will call it grit. It overlaps with grit. I don't want to get into the terminology, but the fact is, it's the notion of being able to be perseverant and also to essentially guide, to have some sense of judgment. Now that evolves. This evolves over the lifetime. We're still seeing a lot of development of executive functioning among teenagers and people even in the early 20s. But early on, having some modicum of executive functioning, striving, persistence, is extraordinarily helpful for young kids in school. So they're learning something very hard. It's unpleasant, learning the alphabet or learning punctuation, whatever it is in the 2nd grade. Very unpleasant maybe for the kid. But the tenacity that's acquired, those skills that allow you to stay on course and to try even if you fail, those are skills which we typically don't appreciate. They're not measured by the SAT, but they are extraordinarily important for producing knowledge in schools and producing people who are productive in society. So
yes, I wanted to ask you this. So you've said that skill formation is a life cycle process that starts at birth, and you've also, as you're now talking about, emphasized the importance of cognitive and non-cognitive skills.
Some people hate the word non-cognitive, so we'll call it social. I mean, every skill has some basis in cognition, I guess. But
that's right.
Social, let's put it this way. The way that Duckworth and I thought about this when we started coining this term was that those skills that aren't commonly tested, things that are not on the NAEP reports or in the GREs or the SATs, and there are a lot of skills that aren't tested typically.
Right, and so what you're suggesting is that both this multiple set of skills, or you've called them abilities, right? Yeah. Skills and abilities begin forming at birth, very early in life, and build on each other.
Yes.
So can you just say a little more about that?
Well, so there is a component. First of all, prenatal conditions play a huge role. Yeah. We know that. I mean, it's been very well documented now that children, parents, mothers who are living in situations of starvation, or for that matter, aspects of terror, war, various kinds of adverse circumstances, the children of those mothers will suffer and afterward. There are some real effects that are created in the womb, real exchange, and this whole process of transmission of experience through the mother's womb to the child has been very well researched in biology and in human biology as well. So, but the fact of the matter is that these various skills, you see, we typically, one of the big fallacies, I think, it was a big fallacy in the 20th century, was thinking that IQ was the be all and end all of success. One of your colleagues, Charles Murray, wrote a book on the bell curve, and that book was basically talking about who was smart and who wasn't, and describing human differences in those terms. And I think the book was very useful in the sense of opening up the application of psychological methods into the study of human differences. But it turned out there are a lot of other human differences. IQ explains only about 5 or 6% of the total present value of lifetime earnings. So, as the old saying was, if you're not smart, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? And I think that's true. So we see a lot of other attributes are there. Sears and Roebuck, I used to live very close to where I am right now, basically was making the statement, Rosenwald, I'm sorry, I'm confusing the Stills, made the statement I once heard that he was a very ordinary man and he didn't have any particular ability. And in fact, most of the millionaires that he met in Chicago at that time were not very smart, but they had been able to stumble across ideas that could take advantage of opportunities. And those are some of the very traits that we're talking about as non-cognitive skills. So they probably could be lousy at making, doing physics experiments. J.P. Morgan was no doubt a genius at math, but there are a lot of millionaires and billionaires who want it all good, and yet they see something. And it's that creativity, which is not captured by test scores. So that's the part that I think is really becoming understood, that we have these multiple dimensions. And they're not just fixed. See, you made a distinction that's really important in the literature. They talk about ability versus skills. Now, a lot of psychologists, if any psychologists are listening, will bristle at that distinction. I remember when I first started working on personalities psychology, I started calling them skills. They're not skills, they're abilities. And by that, they meant, like the early pioneers of IQ, that these were genetically determined. But they're not. And what we've learned is that both IQ and these social and emotional skills can be created by experience. And I'm not just dreaming this up. We have a lot of experiments. We followed people. We have this data set now that we followed people up into the mid-50s, an experiment that supplemented family life, and it produced higher IQs and more motivated people. So those skills are malleable, and that means it's a good thing, because it's not just a question of how you're born. This is not a eugenics fantasy circa 1920. This is really a 2021 vision of what is going to go on about the way that human potential can be realized. And I think the understanding that there are multiple traits, that they reinforce each other, and they reinforce each other in their development. So here's another example. Think about just smoking and health. Think about various kinds of health practices. It turns out that more conscientious people as a group are less likely to smoke. They're more likely to be educated. And as a result, you go down the life cycle, they're healthier. The conscientiousness led to their acquiring education, which taught them about the advantages of not smoking. And it also allowed them to undertake aspects of self-control, which allowed them to quit smoking if they started, and so forth. So it's this multiplicity of abilities. The whole public policy discussion is so limited. Think even today, people are talking about NAEP scores, the NAEP score is for blacks and whites, or for people from Georgia versus people from Colorado, and that's okay. It's a dimension, but there's so many dimensions to human flourishing, and we're now understanding them. We're beginning to understand. Public policy isn't, though. It just isn't. Not yet.
So I'd like to put what you've been explaining in the context of the very well-known Heckman Curve,
Yes.
which we'll show here. You can see that. So the curve is widely cited as describing returns on investment, very specifically defined as public spending on government, say, early childhood programs like pre-K or childcare. Mm-hmm. That's how it's usually cited, as though what we mean by investment is public spending. But you've also written about family environments and parenting as an essential investment in early skill building. Can you talk?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you talk about if and how families fit into what we know as the Heckman Curve?
Well, see, one of the traditions at Chicago, I mentioned human capital. But there was another tradition in Chicago that in some sense is probably more important, and that's the study of the economics of the family. I mean, Becker pioneered it. Becker was my colleague, and I mourn his departure. We had lots of good conversations, and I really learned a great deal from him, and the world did too. But in particular, the economics of the family life is not, I think there's an art, this is a result, I think this is strictly an artifice of the way that academia is structured and the way government programs are structured. Because you, for example, get something like an early child program, a program like Head Start, say, or a program of other, a Perry program, for example. And those are programs that we think of as kinds of external programs that are outside and are offered to parents or given to parents. But what is not understood yet, it's beginning to be understood. We have a lot of very exciting work showing how family and these programs interact. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of what these programs and often are doing is what parents are doing already. And in fact, it's an irony to me. We have a lot of evaluations now of government programs targeted towards younger children. We could do with a lot more. There's a lot more to do. But we don't have, and to me it's amazing deficiency, we don't have any good economic and social study of the impact of a mother on the child's outcome. And my guess is that if you had that curve that you were showing and you added the role of the mother, that you would find that the returns are even higher. And in fact, the idea that the program and the mother are separate is crazy. These programs only become productive when the mother or the family caretaker, whoever it is. I'm using the word mother because frequently it is a mother, but it may not be. But the structure is such that these programs, there's a synergism between these programs, and there is a substitution too, in some sense, that the child care programs, in some cases, are playing the role of what the mother is doing already. And it's amazing to me when you see these very high rates of return on early childhood programs, and I've written about them. We get returns around 13% per annum. I'm willing to bet that if we really evaluated what the benefits were of a mother working with the child and educate, we'd find rates of return more like 30 or 40%. But nobody's ever studied it. It's a pathology of the way research is funded and the way we think about the family as a separate entity from a lot of aspects of public policy. But these child care programs that I've looked at are only successful when they kind of turn on the parents. They get the mother informed and they get the mother engaged. That's the secret for them. It's engaging the family, and frequently the mother is the family. So it's the separation is there, I realize, academically and even in public policy. But the reality is they're not separable. And in fact, good public policy would join them and would nourish both the family and these programs, forming a bond between these programs and the mother, the family, the father, and whatever.
So one of my favorite things that you've ever written is the best documented market failure in the life cycle of skill formation in contemporary American society is the inability of children to buy their parents. What do you mean by that, and how does it relate to inequality?
Well, economists are very like to formulate these public policy, and at least many economists, not all, but many public policy economists would like to formulate the reason for public policy being some kind of market failure. The argument would be, why can't the market take care of this, that, or the other thing? And I think one thing that's very apparent, though, is that there isn't a very good market on the part of the fetus. So we can call it maybe a homunculus. Let's go back to Goethe, some primordial creature in bargaining, which family am I going to be born into and get those advantages? That is truly an accident of birth, and it's not marketable, and it's really not very easily insurable, but it is decisive. There is a market failure in the sense that there could easily be a situation where we have a young Mozart or a young, I don't know, young Wittgenstein, a young Einstein, born into a family, say, in Central Africa, without any capacity to go to school or to learn music or to do the, and so those opportunities that families provide would limit the opportunity. I think there's a lot of human potential that is wasted for that reason. And I think that's a scope for public policy. So there is a market failure. So there are two ways to fix it. One is to essentially, you can say, well, we can somehow try to remediate later down the road. And a second is you can, nourish the family so that that kind of accident of birth becomes less of a decisive factor in the larger social policy. Those are two different ways, and I think they're complementary ways.
So you're assessing the root of inequality and barriers to social mobility as deriving from the family.
See, this is one thing that's not understood, and I think it's really, if you look at the statistics, by the way, the statistics about income inequality and the growth of income inequality, usually the statistics are statistics about what's called family income, right? Now, there's a lot of bad work being done there, where families are equated to tax units, and tax units and families are not the same. Okay, but put that to the side. I think what we really have come to understand is that some of the major growth of inequality, it has nothing whatsoever just to do with hourly wage rates at the factory. It also has to do with the change in family structure in the larger society. More children, more single parent families. And what does that mean? It means then often the mother is with a child, she faces the burden of supporting that child, and she faces a lot of she's really under stress, financial stress. And as a result, and by the way, the single parent family has fewer resources. And so as single parent families grow, inequality itself grows. And then there's the other aspect of the family that increasingly we're seeing more sorting among those families, among couples which do form and form two-parent families. There's more sorting. Educated males and educated females, they meet at school, they marry and have children. And that leads to another group which is not marrying or less educated, which leads to a lot of inequality. So the family is a major driver. It's not just in producing children, but it's even in the basic statistics. That's the part. It just, to me, the electric wire or the third rail of American policy, and you know this, I'm just saying an homily. Nobody wants to talk about the family. And the family is the whole story. The family is the whole story. And it's a whole story about a lot of social and economic issues. And these policies I'm talking about are supplements to the family.
Right.
So, yeah. Sorry, I'm going on.
No. It's absolutely fascinating. So you've been doing some really interesting research in Denmark that I think bears on this. Can you tell us about that work and how it's contributing to your thinking on the role of families, the effects of programs, and so forth?
Well, to me, I mean, the Danish study is fascinating.
So tell us what it is.
Okay, well, first of all, Denmark is viewed. I think I have a quote from one of the papers from the Washington Post saying the future, America's future is in the Scandinavian states. I'm paraphrasing it, I'm badly. But the idea, and we have many people, and it's not just Bernie Sanders, it's not just Hillary Clinton, and there are many people, left and right, who sort of see the Scandinavian welfare state as an ideal model. Universal health care. It does have universal health care. And it's pretty equal, the access. The qualities are pretty equal. You have free college education. Everybody can go to college, no tuition. You have universal pre-K, more or less. At this point, you have childcare, generous leaves. You have many of the features that are out there in the public domain that are truly considered to be solutions for the American problem about social mobility and inequality. And yet, and this is something that staggered me, I've been working with a very brilliant young Danish economist at the Rockwell Foundation in Copenhagen. And his name is Rasmus Landerson. But what we found, and this staggered me, he took a class with me maybe 5 years ago, and he came to Chicago and took this class with me. And I was talking about inequality in America. And in the back of the class, he brought his computer, but he also had access to the whole Danish register system, which means that he has data on the lifetimes of all these Danish citizens from birth to death, what schools they went to, who they went to school with, what their wages were, their employment history, their health, their employment in other occupations, where they live, who lives next to them, their house value. Tremendous data. And so he was able, just by the time the class was finished, to reproduce American counterparts in the Danish data. And so we started working together. We wrote a paper. I just wondered, well, how much does US inequality compare with Danish inequality? And in the course of this work, we found that in many dimensions, Danish inequality, in terms of skills, in terms of mortality. So let me describe the dimension of inequality more precisely. If you look at the education of the mother, the birth mother, and you ask how much does that explain the life outcome, we're able to trace out the life outcomes of children by their parents' socioeconomic status, measured initially by the education of the mother, but other dimensions now as well. And we find that the gaps that are present in American society are of the same order of magnitude as they are in Denmark. And this has been a huge controversy in Denmark. I've given some seminars in Denmark, and Rasmus is famous in Denmark, justly so, because they like to think all the welfare states really doing well. But what happened was, and what this really shows that I think is extremely important, is that despite all these public policies that are out there, that they aren't that effective in eliminating this fundamental source of inequality. And of course, the fundamental source of inequality is the family. It's the family. And then you get to some really basic issues. We want to get to a situation like Socrates envisioned, Plato, thinking of putting all children in orphanages to equalize them. And I don't think anybody wants that. We know, in fact, when you do that, you create enormous social waste. So what actually, the family influence is not so easily displaced by the kind, and to me, I think this should be highly relevant in the discussions we're about to have about new policies in America. Everybody's pointing to Denmark saying, oh, look, universal childcare. Well, okay, I'm not opposed to any of those things, but I'm still saying, despite all that, there are substantial inequalities. And it's not just that they're unequal. The world, people are always going to be different from each other in some ways, but the fact is they're of the same order of magnitude as in America. And the Danes find that totally unacceptable because they see themselves as having created a society with full equality. The one way that they do have more equality is in the income distribution. But how is that achieved? That's through taxes and transfers. Very high tax rate, very, very progressive, a lot of redistribution. So if you look at the so-called Gini coefficient, notions that the Gini coefficient in Scandinavia generally much lower, much more equal societies in terms of income after tax and transfers. Income before tax and transfers, not so much. And what you do see then is essentially a redistributive state, which is causing income equality. But what's happening, and this is the part that I think is most interesting for me and for the current discussion, if you look at how much does this affect social mobility, there's this notion, this Gatsby curve, that received a lot of attention some 6 or 7 years ago with Alan Kruger, when late Alan Kruger was in the White House. I think he was the head of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Obama. But anyway, he pushed this curve. And basically, the idea was that more inequality at a point in time led to more immobility, so that you were more or less stuck in the same position as your parents were. That there wasn't so much social immobility, and that's been the theme of a lot of papers recently in the American, New York Times in particular, but other people, a lot of different groups pushing this. But what we found was that the social mobility in terms of education and skill was the same in Denmark as the US. So if we look at the education of the parents and the education of the children, It's at the same degree. So wait a minute, they're not producing skills at any greater rate. What they are doing is they're redistributing income. And part of the reason why the skills aren't being reproduced, it's not the whole story, is that very high tax and transfer system is actually leading to disincentives to acquire skills. That's another big story, but Rasmus in particular, my co-author, has a very interesting study of his own, which we cite in our papers, which showed that when a job training program, job subsidy program was given for disadvantaged youth, they took advantage of the program, but at the cost of going to school and learning more valuable skills. So the work training programs there were, I guess, comparable to a lot of what happens here in the US. So I'm not saying the whole story is there. I'm not trashing but I think that the dream, the fiction, I think this is very important work, extremely important work. And for me, it's clarifying what's going on. And I think market processes, I think the notion of sorting is very pervasive, both in the US and in Denmark. With the Danish data, we're able to study those processes in a much more flexible way. So we're not saying that Denmark is the same as the US. The Denmark has its own minorities, though. It has a very substantial Arabic population, which is very disadvantaged, more recent, nothing comparable to the African American. But what we find is something that is amazingly important, I think, about the role of family and the fact that family is playing a central role in ways. So the way I put it, Max Weber was this sociological theorist, the economist, sociologist, a very broad thinker and important, influential thinker. But his idea of the bureaucracy, he wrote a book on bureaucracy, and he did a lot of work thinking about how a welfare state should be, or we didn't call it a welfare state, but how a government redistributing or dealing with people on what we would call now a welfare state would function. And a crucial feature was equal access. So equal access under the law, that sounds perfect. That sounds like the American ideal. It was his ideal, equal access. Well, guess what? Equal access doesn't do it. The reason is that more affluent parents, more engaged parents can always find opportunities in that system, which less engaged parents won't. So the children will benefit, even though the same benefits are realized. There's an economist at Berkeley, Chris Walters, very smart guy, did some very interesting work on charter schools. And he looked at a population of kids who were relatively disadvantaged. And he looked at what the impact of charter schools were. And he found a positive impact of charter schools on the kids' performance. But then he found that the kids who benefited the most from the charter schools were the disadvantaged. But the parents who got their kids into charter schools among this pool were the most advantaged. And so there's an example. Now, and that's a real public policy question. I don't think it's a question myself personally, but it's a real fact about what a free society is doing here. And we should admit it, and we should build that into policy. And I don't mean by forbidding parents. Like in California, years ago, there was this reform which helped destroy the public schools in California. Remember, I've forgotten what the proposition was. It was in the late 70s. And basically, they forbade parents to come in and supplement the schools and give extra. And so the idea was to equalize. And as a result, you neutralize some of the impact of the parent. There's still those effects there, but they're more subdued. So I think we do want to harvest the powerful force of love and attachment for the child. That is such a powerful force. And I just think we have to cope with it and then understand that for certain aspects of society, the people who drew a blank in the lottery of life, if you want, or didn't do so well, that there might be some compensation down the road. And my thinking about what the form of that social insurance might be would be to help supplement the home life and make the home life more effective for the child. So that's where I link this conversation back. So, but it's an interesting question. I dearly wish I could talk to Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton and many others. It's not that I have any great hatred of the Danish wealth. The Danes are very happy. If you've been to Denmark, right?
Never, no.
Oh, if you go down the street in a place like Aarhus or something, you see all these families. It's truly heartwarming. They really love their children and they engage. And it's great. It's great. So, but I think the idea is that there still is this sense that some families are better at doing that than others, and we can do something about it. Here's another aspect about some of the programs that have been put forward are very formulaic. They come out of these cookie cutter models that are frequently put for a program. We must have this curriculum, we must have these requirements and so forth. And what I think is really relevant and really, really important is that we understand that we need some real flexibility built into this system, and that these that it's that encouragement, that building this attachment and linkage, and that some parents literally don't know how to be a good parent. Now, if you say that sounds, in some circles it'll be viewed as racist or sexist, or what. I don't think it's sexist, but racist or somehow anti whatever. But I think what it is, and this is documented, Flavio Cunha at Rice has done a number of studies, and others before him, less systematically, have documented that if you ask a lot of disadvantaged mothers, what's the normal growth trajectory for a 2-year-old for reading, they don't know. And that's true even if they have other siblings who do have 2-year-old children, because probably those 2-year-old siblings didn't grow all that well either. So there's a sense in which we can empower parents, but the whole activity has to be to engage the family. So I think it's the family, and I don't know if public policy has gotten there yet.
So along those lines, as you know, the idea that universal preschool programs, essentially beginning the public school system at birth rather than 5, that a couple of things, that number one, that this is the way to address these problems of disadvantage and social mobility. Number two, that these programs are highly cost effective. They'll pay for themselves many times over. So I have 2 questions. One is, what is your assessment of the cost effectiveness piece? And 2, what effect do you think, if we did have universal preschool programs starting at birth, what effect do you think that would have on problems of poverty and lack of social mobility?
Well, first of all, why not have universal? I mean, the fact is that if you go to advantaged environments, they're not going to use those programs. What the mother or their environments are doing, or the childcare, so you could offer them these programs, they're not going to take it. You're not going to go to Winnetka and open a Head Start program when they can go to a childcare, an enriched childcare center, a Waldorf type school, or some kind of school which the parents carefully encourage and cultivate. So in some sense, it's a political ploy, universality. And you can always have universality in which you have a graduated schedule. So you could say, okay, look, yes, we'll open it in Winnetka or some of the other affluent suburbs in North Shore of Chicago, but we'll pay you full freight. You have to pay the full freight. But if we do it in Inglewood, a poor neighborhood in Chicago, not so far from here actually, that you would actually find it would be free or very heavily subsidized. So that's one program. But I think the finding that is spouted a lot, and I've seen this, people have thanked me for providing the basis for it. What I have found systematically, and I think it's known by any serious scholar in these programs who've looked at it, that the greatest benefits are to the disadvantaged. So it's exactly those kids growing up in disadvantaged homes where the parents maybe don't have enough knowledge, or maybe just enough skill, or may themselves not be all that fluent in language or capable of helping the child, where the parents might need a boost. Learning parenting. A lot of very successful programs in less developed countries that are successful in turning on parenting at much lower cost than these current programs like Head Start and ABC and Perry and many other programs. So I think the targeting, where the evidence is, all the iconic studies, everything I've ever done has been targeted to disadvantaged children. I don't have, there's one program called the IHDP program, which has been studied, and there is some work on it by Wiswall at Wisconsin and Sojourner at the University of Minnesota. And there are some benefits from that program, but the main benefits always accrue to the disadvantaged. And that's because the parenting environments are not as strong, and the advantages that we were talking about having a good family, good is too value laden, but a rich family life offering lots of stimulation, let's call that, let's use that word, those advantages aren't shared by everybody, and those programs can do it. But it's the disadvantaged who actually do this, who benefit the most. And that, I think, is, so I don't mind. I know that there, for political purposes, people want to say it's universal, and I know the argument. The argument is you don't want to stigmatize. So if you're giving it, so the argument is, well, everybody will like universal pre-K because you're not just giving it to the poor. And that means then that we're not stigmatizing the poor. But the fact of the matter is that if we want not to waste money, we would target it to disadvantaged kids. Just, that's fact.
So there's two things that have been worrying me about the universal thing that I'd love to get your thoughts on. The first is we have universal K-12, right? We have universal public education starting in kindergarten and at this point in most places. And my background actually is in K-12. I worked with very disadvantaged low-income schools in New York City for 10 years. And
well, you may have it, but right now in Chicago, we don't have it.
So in my, right, no, this was the old pre-pandemic.
No, I understand.
Right. So, but what I observed is that we have a universal system, and at some point, it has evolved into a system in which disadvantaged kids are ill-served by that system to a considerable degree, whereas more advantaged families, often their public schools are working great for them. So one of the things that worries me about implementing a universal system is, well, one could start out with a kind of a clean slate and a lot of excitement. And yet there seems to be this trend in which, this tendency in which eventually there's the possibility that the more disadvantaged children will be in lower quality programs. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, in the case of the public schools, there's no question that there's a lot of sorting going on. That's part of this sorting process, which is going on in Denmark and here's an interesting finding in Denmark, just to go back to Denmark and then answer your question. In Denmark, teachers' wages are the same everywhere. There aren't teachers, I mean, here in Chicago area, the teachers on the north side will earn a lot more than teachers in one of the very poor suburbs on the south side. None of that goes on in Denmark. There's full equalization. And yet, if you look at the quality of the teachers who are actually in those neighborhoods, they're very strongly sorted by the education and affluence of the parents. Why? It's not like they're slipping a 50 under the table or something. It's that this is exactly how economics would predict it. They can't get paid in money, but what they can get paid in is good students and motivated students, and that makes a teacher's life a joy, as opposed to a chore working with unmotivated and not very bright students. So literally, there's an awful lot of sorting that goes on, even when you mandate equality, and it is mandated. We know what their salaries are, so we know what they're getting. There's no cheating, and yet that's the point here. Is that again in the public schools in Chicago, rich parents, not always rich, by the way. It's not a question of money. By the way, this is one of the big fallacies in this area. And I think it's an artifact of using certain kinds of statistics. Right now, there's this big discussion. There's a whole group of child development psychologists and economists working with them who will argue that poverty is the big problem for child outcomes. And they will argue, oh, what we should do is give them more money. And if we give them more money, we will solve their problems. Okay. The fact of the matter is that it's not just money. It really is not just money. And I think people who actually are, but the point is that some parents, motivated parents, even very uneducated parents, but motivated parents, can produce very effective, successful lives for their children. And they do all the time. This was studied here in the housing projects in Chicago. You had women who were basically illiterate, not illiterate, but low levels of education, not very skilled, whose children came out in a very healthy, normal, functioning way. And they always talk about the home life that was created for them by their parents, usually the mother. And so and you see stories like this made. I mean, Roland Fryer, for example, at Harvard, will always talk about his aunt who sort of took care of him and so forth. And she was a teacher. And so the point is so having that family influence, that person, it's not always a question of money, but it is a question of parenting, engagement with the child, attachment, interaction, and the like. And I think that's what's missing from the discussion. So throwing money at a problem, honest to God, it sickens me that 60 years after we did that on a wide scale and got very limited results, that there's another whole revival of this. And the problem is statistics. It's that right now we have very crude data on poverty. So what's the measure of child poverty? The measure sounds reasonable. Income. Poor kids have families with less income. I don't think that's the right definition of child poverty. I think the right definition of child poverty is children who have living in environments which don't stimulate them, which don't encourage them, rich or poor. So they can be very, very poor, relatively poor, and have a stimulating, engaged relationship with their parent. But that's not understood. So we look at these statistics and, food stamps, not food stamps, free lunch criteria. And I understand the political discussion lives on that, and the so-called evidence-based analysis uses these crude measures of poverty, but it doesn't really get to the core of what poverty is or what family influence is. So again, it's like people don't want to talk about the family. They want to talk about something that's, quote, more objective. And I think, don't you think that's a central question in American society now? Nobody wants to talk about the family.
Yes.
To me, it's amazing. It's like we have this problem staring us in the face, and everybody wants to look the other way and say, kind of hide. Oh, no, it's not it. We're going to do everything but the family. So.
Right. Well, so sort of on the flip side, another thing that worries me is, and there's an economics term for this, that and I think there's some evidence that this may have happened in Quebec when they implemented universal childcare, that if there is both free or close to free childcare available, and even a norm established of mothers working and putting their kids in childcare, that good mothering could be displaced by mediocre childcare. That it would reduce the quality of children's environments by displacing their home environment with a childcare environment. What do you think of that?
Well, I think this study that you're talking about is done by several people, I think, including Gruber, famous for his famous video about Obamacare. But this is a good study. So forget about the error. But I think yes, what was found is that as a result of that, these were warehouses. You want to separate out child care from child development. And the child care that he was studying, that they were studying, by the way, was found mostly for the boys. The girls were robust. So all the effects of it, but yes, they actually were, and that's a general finding throughout. Boys are very vulnerable in a way that girls are not. Disadvantaged boys versus disadvantaged girls. And it's not just African Americans. We have other studies that suggest that vulnerability, but that's a different story. But the structure that I think is really really important here is that, yes, because they were put in these warehouses, that there are famous extremes here. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the studies of the Romanian orphans. Now, the child care centers in Quebec were not orphanages in Romania. No, they were not anywhere close. But what they were is fairly impersonal. There wasn't any real quality. And so I agree. If you take somebody from a quality environment and put them in an inferior environment, you can make them worse off. No question. So quality has to be a sine qua non of the whole enterprise. You've got to really make sure that the children are getting quality. And if they don't, you can hurt them. That makes perfect sense. Forget about childcare and think about a grade school. I mean, suppose you imagine you taking a kid out of a good school in third grade, and then you go to a lousy school in another third, they'll do worse. And they could do even worse than not going to school at all. So that's what happened in Montreal, and it's happened elsewhere. So quality is important, really important quality. And in the absence of the quality that was offered at the home was a real issue. It's a real issue. I'll give you an example that's even more dramatic than that, though. I've been in Brazil a lot over the years, not recently, but I was in Brazil. And I remember we were studying this question of working women in Brazil. And childcare was a real issue in Brazil. I mean, a real crisis. And these are poor women living in favelas and so forth. They had nobody, no family member to look after the kid. So what they would do, I'm laughing.
Oops. We just lost your sound.
I lost my sound.
Yeah, you're good. You're back.
Maybe it's telling me to shut up, in which case I
No.
This is a divine signal.
No.
No, but what they would do, seriously, what they would do is they would tie the child's leg to a table. And some of the younger children would wind themselves around and choke themselves to death or something. There were terrible stories like that. Now, this was in an extremely poor area and so forth. So that's a great example of, the mother working and the child. So I'm not suggesting there's anything like that going on in the US, or maybe not much. But yeah, you can make things worse. I don't think there's any question about it.
So we've gotten some chats, some questions in the chat box here. So this is a question which is kind of not a serious question, but I'm interested in what you'd say about it. Should we randomize the distribution of newborns to families to correct the market failure?
Well, that's one thing you could do. That's a version of Plato's idea of assigning. You could do it. The trouble is that I think you'd lose the incentive. There's a very powerful incentive. If you have this little kid that looks like you and somehow has, I think family is deeper than that, but it's on the right wavelength. You could also change the environments, though. You could randomize the environments a little bit, maybe, and in that sense, provide a richer environment. So you could either change take the kid into a better environment or make the environment better. Maybe I'd favor the latter.
So a colleague of mine runs a group of charter schools in New York City, and he's been teaching something in middle school, which is called the success sequence, which is trying to teach kids to do things in a particular order that leads to more success in life. First graduate, then get a job, then get married, and then have a kid, in that order. And yeah, and so I guess his question is, if does it make, what he's finding is that there's a lot of resistance in general to the idea of teaching young people that this doing things in this particular order usually yields better results. But it does. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that would be? How well do you think it could work to start, for example, teaching in middle schools, teaching kids that their lives will turn out better if they don't, for example, have a kid before they have graduated or gotten a job?
To me, if you didn't teach that, you'd really be remiss. I mean, in some fundamental sense, We know that for a fact, that when children, or young children, young adults, let's call them, have a child out of wedlock, and if they take responsibility for that child, even if they don't, but if they do, that's going to generally impair their progress. I did a study, for example, of GED women many years ago, 10 years ago. I wrote a book on the subject. And what we found was that a lot of the GED women who took the GED, they dropped out of high school because they had a kid. And so they basically did not graduate high school. They did, however, after the kid got to the age where they could put the kid in a child care center, the parents could, a little bit of freedom for the mother, they could get a GED. And then frequently they get a GED and then enroll in a community college and so forth. And so what was happening is they delayed an onset of a trajectory. So if you looked at age 30 and 35, they were getting back to a normal trajectory for somebody who hadn't had a kid, but it delayed everything. And their lifetime earnings were lower. It just kind of reduced their mobility. To me, what was amazing though, very nice, was that those GED women took that opportunity. I'm not saying all GEDs did this, but those women who dropped, those girls who dropped out of school, had the kid, and at one point that used to be mandatory, right? You couldn't have a kid and stay in high school, at least in some of these subjects we studied. And they partially compensated for it, but they delayed everything. And so that had real impact on their earnings and on their subsequent, and their marriage rates. Women with a kid bringing into marriage frequently will have less good sorting, in the sense of finding a partner who's willing to support them and is somebody comparable to what they would like to have done in the absence of this other aspect of having a child already in advance. So you can talk, I think you should teach them that. To me, why not? This is like teaching the facts of life. And so, but the trouble is, what worries me is that this kind of discussion about saying, well, I don't think it's telling them what they have to do. I think it's just giving them information about what happens if they don't do it. What happens? So it's not, I think it's not a prescription. I think people are worried more about putting everybody in a common mold. I'm sure there are a lot of very creative people who broke that mold, very much so. But I do think that a lot of people have found that mold successful. And a lot of children born to such couples have also found that very successful.
Yes.
You know, for example, one thing that I found we did this intergenerational study of the Perry preschool program. So we looked at the Perry program and we followed these people. They're now almost 60 years old. So they have children. We followed their children. And what we found is that the children of the participants of the Perry preschool were doing very well. But then we looked at what were the sources of success? Which ones were successful second generation Perry people? They were the ones born to parents who had two-parent families. They stayed together. They had the higher earnings that we're talking about, because if both parents were home or both parents were around, generally the family earnings were higher. They're more stable families, and those kids prospered. So the benefit of the Perry program was partly the benefits of getting second generation stable marriages, which I think is amazingly interesting. So it just propagates this idea that yes, you can build successful lives. And the counterparts, children who were born to parents, either the control group children or the children the control group, there were different aspects of the control. Some control group children, dropped out and so forth and so forth, but there wasn't so much attrition. But what I'm suggesting is that the general thrust of this is that there were successful second generation lives, and the main mediator was the family formation that created that. So I'm mumbling for a second there, but I'm trying to state it clearly.
So I'm getting multiple questions from people all over New Mexico, Canada, saying that, for example, in New Mexico, Heckman's data has been used in New Mexico to push for universal all-day pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds. where I live, Professor Heckman is most often cited as supporting universal national daycare programs. His views on family influence are never mentioned. And the question is, does it bother Professor Heckman that his views and thinking are distorted?
Does it bother me? Well, I guess what I should say is it's kind of like the the Tillich, the Niebuhr humility prayer. I shouldn't worry about things that I can do something about. And look, I remember a few years ago, I was actually in Korea, and Jeff Sachs and I were there, and he complimented me for providing the support for de Blasio's universal pre-K program in New York. And it was a short conversation, but I was horrified because I never said that. I mean, I certainly wasn't, I have said universal, but with the qualification that you might have a sliding schedule. But, people, I think that's the least of all the misrepresentations going out there in the larger world. So I mean, I don't go to bed at night chewing my teeth and gnashing it and feeling like I should jump out a window, but I do feel that it doesn't. No, but I do feel the whole issue of the family does not get discussed. I mean, in the black-white issue, I know that's not where you want to go, and it's very sensitive these days, but to me, it's extraordinarily troublesome that there isn't a more honest discussion. In the African-American scholarly community, there is an honest discussion. But when I talk about it, forget it. I'm an intruder, and so I'll keep my mouth shut. I've written on it, and I think the data are there. But you can. I wish there were more discussion of the family. And you see, what bothers me too is that when you see when you look at this support for public policy analysis, this is something that I've experienced this a lot, that there's a lot of resistance to going places where you're really getting to the core and possibly then maybe touching some sensibilities that people don't want. If it's a public review, some national review board, peer review, where people have certain political or social views, it gets very hard to sort of probe and go more deeply. So I think it's hard to actually go and study things like the family to the extent that needs to be studied. And like I'm saying, I think it'd be fantastic not to essentially give money to a bunch of kids who are relatively poor. It can't hurt. I don't think it's the least effective, actually. I think it's not. I think we have studies showing that targeted versions of that kind of program are much better than just open cash grants to families. But be that as a way, people can waste money. I mean, if Gates and others want to waste money, I think, what was it? There was a great quotation from Benjamin Franklin saying that a fool and his money are easily parted. I think that goes with a lot of foundations supporting these causes. And let them do it. If they enjoy it, they can do it. They can meet their boards. But I think getting to the essence of what social problems are, what the family's doing, and the power of the family, and even evaluating what is a mother really worth, and just putting that on the same even keel as what we would do with the childcare program. Because we see it, we send some visitors in, we run a childcare center, we can do cost-benefit studies. Some of those programs are very, very generous. But I still can't help but think that the mother's value is going to be so much bigger because she has all these bonds and she's there 24 hours a day. And anyway, at least 16 hours a day, maybe 24 with little kids. So I honestly think the structure, they're just right now, as things stand, that we are kind of preventing ourselves from seeing real problems. And I think we do that all over in society. I sometimes wonder whether or not social science isn't doing more harm than good. No, I do it. I see it because we get these categories and we get frozen on these categories, like test scores. IQ. Okay, it was an interesting idea 100 years ago, but it's a peanuts part of the whole story. If you were to focus the success of a life on IQ, you're a fool. I mean it. You're a fool. You may make a lot of money doing it, but you're a fool. And honestly, I think that but it's very hard because these things are entrenched. And academia has got this wonderful feature of kind of ossifying every good idea. No idea should not just become entrenched and die on the vine. And that worries me. I worry that academia is doing a lot of that. So
Well,
it's hard to kind of rage.
Yeah, we're just at 5:15. I can't tell you how fantastic this has been. This has been one of the most fascinating conversations I've had in a long, long time. And I'm
Well,
so
enjoyed it. We should continue it. We don't have to do it online and publicly. But these are issues that I feel deeply about. I mean, and it's not that I have a political axe to grind. I really don't. I mean, I really think we should do something about disadvantaged children. And I think we should do something about groups of people who are suffering from having adverse family lives. But I think, whoops,
you're back.
I don't know why.
There you are.
I think it's telling me it's 5:15 and I should hang up. But wait, I'm still getting that I'm muted. Is that no?
No, you're good. We can hear you. Yeah.
But I think these issues. But see, the beautiful thing is that not only do I think these ideas are important, but they're really interesting. From a point of view of an academic working on these questions, they pose enormous challenges. And challenges that keep you up. Graduate students will ask me, what should I work on? And I would give them the answer, always the answer, work on whatever you can't help but work on. And that's my case. This is such a deep, important problem. So I'm glad we had a chance to discuss it. I'm happy to discuss it further with you or other people. I just wish the family would get back into more of the center of our life. Everybody knows it's important, but it's changing too. And I think that's the part of the society that people have not quite put their hands around, all the traditional views. So the role of women is changing. It's not the same as it was 60 years ago. And a lot of people have trouble with that as well. And so we might want to think about arrangements that are more flexible, that accommodate the kind of changes that women want now, and many women want, but not all women. I can't speak for women or anybody else for that matter, except myself. But I think that the family life is so fascinating, and it's not just an academic issue. It's the core problem in American society is misunderstanding of the family. So.
All right. Well, I very much look forward to continuing the conversation.
Well, it's good being with you. Okay. Take care. I enjoyed it very much.
Okay.